Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into one of the most uh, intellectually charged and comprehensive critiques of religion ever written. Christopher Hitchens' monumental work, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything.
That title really is less a suggestion and more of an operating thesis, isn't it? This isn't just commentary. It's a declaration of war on bad ideas, but viewed through this really rigorous application of critical thinking, historical evidence, and literary analysis.
Right. And our mission today is really to distill that intellectual rigor, to understand the foundation of evidence and logic he built his arguments on, so that you, the listener, can walk away well-informed about the specifics of his critique.
And we're not here to engage in mockery or sensationalism. We're here to understand the argument.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating right out of the gate is that Hitchens' skepticism wasn't born from some abstract academic debate. It came from a really profound personal failure reason he witnessed as a child.
Yeah, this is the origin story of his intellectual radicalization, and it centers on, of all people, the kindest person imaginable, Mrs. Jean Watts.
His teacher, right.
His nature instructor and his Bible teacher at a school near Dartmoor. And she tried to fuse these two roles, science and faith, by looking at the landscape around them. She claimed that God made vegetation green because it is exactly the color that is most restful to our eyes.
And young Hitchens, who was already, showing an aptitude for deep textual analysis, he loved the compulsory search the scriptures assignment because it meant he had to read the surrounding chapters to get the true point. He instantly recognized the error.
It was an immediate, crystalline failure of logic for him. He realized this pious, seemingly benign statement was fundamentally dishonest. Green vegetation isn't restful because some deity designed it for human convenience.
No, it's just biology.
It's just biology. It's the necessity for plants to capture energy efficiently. It was a human-centered aesthetic explanation just laid over a cold, indifferent, and necessary biological fact. And that moment, that gentle attempt to fuse faith and nature, became so devastating to him because it exposed this profound failure of epistemology, a faulty method of acquiring knowledge right at the core of religious instruction.
So let's take that foundational anecdote and just project it onto his core claim. Hitchens asserts that religion is entirely a human-made construct. And this construct actively causes measurable, widespread harm by suppressing inquiry and enabling authoritarianism.
His claim is radical because he doesn't just call religion wrong. He defines it as a failed epistemology. It's a system designed to reject new information in favor of ancient, revealed certainty. For Hitchens, the mildest criticism, that religion is man-made, is also the most comprehensive and devastating.
Because if it's just human carpentry,
reflecting the ignorance and bias of ancient men, then any subsequent claim to divine authority is just, well, it's invalidated from the get-go.
And this certainty, this failure of intellectual humility, is what he targets with such venom. He details the combination of stupidity combined with such pride. That's a powerful pairing of insults.
It is, but he uses it specifically to target the hubris of revealed truth. Believers claim certainty with divine warrant. They tell the rest of us that they already possess all the essential information needed to govern life. Everything from complex diet restrictions to rigid sexual morality.
And that's the prideful part.
That's the prideful part. Believing you possess all essential answers in a universe where the more we learn, the more we realize how vast our ignorance truly is. That fixed intellectual position, he argues, should disqualify belief from serious consideration in a world driven by continuous inquiry.
He contrasts this rigid, self-assured certainty with the moral outlook of secular humanism, especially when he's discussing ethics. It's an assertion that always makes you stop and think. Atheists don't believe in heaven or hell, yet no statistic will ever find that without these blandishments and threats, we commit more crimes.
He finds that whole notion that human morality fundamentally requires the threat of eternal torture or the promise of infinite reward. He finds it deeply insulting to human potential. Hitchens suggests the evidence would actually run the other way.
Why? Why the other way?
Because religion, paradoxically, has this long, long history of giving innumerable people permission to behave wickedly.
That's the core inversion of divine command theory, isn't it?
Absolutely. The moment your morality is command-based, you can award yourself permission to violate all known moral codes, to act like a brothel keeper or an ethnic cleanser, if you believe you are serving a higher divinely sanctioned authority.
Your conscience is outsourced.
It's completely outsourced. This is why he finds secular ethics superior. Morality derived from innate empathy and rational humanism is self-regulating and non-optional, whereas religious morality is entirely arbitrary, optional, and easily, pushed off onto the whims of a deity or his priests.
This moves us seamlessly into the next major pillar of his critique, the textual analysis. Hitchens insists that if you treat Scripture like any other ancient text, which is what textual criticism is for, you find the clear, muddy fingerprints of human authors reflecting ancient ignorance, not divine insight.
He calls it the lowly stamp of their origin. It's the argument from human carpentry applied universally. He finds inconsistencies, plagiarisms, and moral absurdities that just betray the hand of man.
Okay, so let's start with the Old Testament and the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments.
Right, so rather than finding a timeless moral code, he sees the monarchical growling typical of an ancient emperor's proclamation.
The early commandments are mostly concerned with property rights and ensuring loyalty to the specific tribal god Jehovah. But the most damning textual evidence of human origin is how the condemnation of covetousness is phrased.
It betrays a specific Iron Age, deeply patriarchal context. The 10th commandment forbids coveting your neighbor's house, manservant, maidservant, ox, ass, wife, and other chattel. The inclusion of the wife as a piece of property, listed right alongside livestock and servants, is decisive evidence. An eternal, omniscient God would not categorize half of humanity as male chattel. Only ancient hierarchical male scribes would. It's a document written for and by a Bronze Age or Iron Age culture, period.
So, moving forward to the New Testament, Hitchens quotes H.L. Mencken, describing the Gospels as works of crude carpentry.
I love that phrase. And the inconsistencies aren't peripheral. They strike right at the heart of the core narrative, especially the virgin birth and Jesus' origins.
The contradictions are foundational. They're just impossible to reconcile.
Impossible. Take the genealogies and the logistics of the Nativity. Matthew traces Jesus' lineage back to David through Solomon, while Luke traces it through Nathan. These are mutually exclusive ancestral lines designed to fulfill different prophetic criteria.
And neither of them makes any sense if the child was conceived without Joseph's involvement, right? Since the lineage is tracked entirely through Joseph's legal fatherhood.
Exactly. The whole thing falls apart. And the specific logistics surrounding the birth are just as contradictory.
What does he point to there?
Precisely this. Matthew says Joseph was warned in a dream for an immediate flight to Egypt to escape Herod's infanticide, implying this, desperate urgency. Luke, conversely, has them staying for 40 days in Bethlehem for Mary's purification according to the laws of Moses, after which they go to Jerusalem and then just return safely to Nazareth.
You can't do both.
You cannot flee in immediate terror to Egypt and stay for 40 days for a purification ceremony. The authors were clearly writing for different audiences with different theological agendas.
And that agenda links directly to this concept of prophecy being reverse engineered. The authors were trying to make Jesus' life fit older predictions, even if it created these absurdities.
Yes, the desire to validate the story often just steamrolls plausibility. Hitchens cites the example of Jesus riding an ass into Jerusalem, which seems staged to fulfill Zechariah 9:9. The event looks less like the spontaneous arrival of a Messiah and more like a carefully orchestrated bit of theater to retroactively validate an obscure prediction.
And the virgin birth itself.
Well, the word in the Hebrew text translated as virgin, Alma, it just meant a young woman of marrying age. The translation error was introduced later in the Septuagint. And Hitchens, ever the scientist, notes plainly that parthenogenesis is medically impossible for human mammals.
Right. And the human struggle of the writers, it shows up in the characterization of Mary. I mean, if she had experienced the Archangel Gabriel's visitation, you'd expect her to have an almost supernatural memory of the event.
You would think. Yet she seems constantly perplexed by her son's actions. Jesus is often rude and coarse to her, and she never seems to recall the divine circumstances of his conception. Everything her son does, including his public ministry, seems to come as a complete surprise to the woman who supposedly hosted the divine in her womb.
It strains credulity.
It strains all literary and human credulity, again pointing to an author just struggling to fuse a divine concept onto a human figure.
Now let's transition to the Quran. Hitchens frames Islam as both the most and least interesting monotheism, primarily because it so heavily plagiarizes and builds upon its Jewish and Christian predecessors.
It's a syncretic religion that absorbs and then claims prior revelations, but the textual problems persist here too, maybe even more acutely. The tradition is largely oral, and it lacks the comparison texts, the Hebrew and Latin, that are available for the Bible.
And this led to the theological claim that the Quran is only fully intelligible in Arabic.
Which Hitchens notes leads to the absurd and potentially dangerous conclusion that God was a monoglot. Non-Arabic translations often have to be printed with the Arabic parallel text, demonstrating this fundamental anxiety about the translatability and independence of the source material.
And the mechanics of the revelation itself are scrutinized through the lens of David Hume's critique of miracles.
Hume's question is key here. Which is more likely, that a man is being used as a divine transmitter, or that a man utters existing revelations and claims divine orders? Muhammad experienced profound physical symptoms during revelation. Pain, ringing in his ears, sweating, even on chilly days. The phenomenology of the event suggests, human strain, maybe even epileptic symptoms, not a serene supernatural dictation.
So Hitchens finds the human origin far more plausible.
Far more plausible than the miraculous claim. And finally, you see the continuation of this human-made element in the pagan remnants that Islam absorbed, specifically during the ritual of the Hajj.
What are those?
The Hajj incorporates distinct ancient pre-Islamic propitiations. Pilgrims circle the cuboid Kaaba shrine 7 times. They kiss the black stone, which Hitchens notes is a probable meteorite, and they hurl pebbles defiantly at a rock that represents the evil one. These rituals are demonstrably older, polytheistic traditions that were absorbed and sanctioned by the new monotheism.
Which just proves that the faith was built literally on existing local customs.
Reinforcing the argument of a cobbled-together human origin.
Exactly.
This brings us directly to the title's famous claim. Religion poisons everything. Hitchens argues this is not theoretical. He uses his experience as a foreign correspondent to show that religion is a direct, immediate source of global violence and hatred, infecting our faculties of discernment.
And he makes that visceral point that in places like Belfast, Beirut, and Baghdad, he would feel immediately threatened if a group of men approaching him came straight from a religious observance.
That's a stunning field observation. It just strips away all the romantic notions of piety. It's about the tangible, immediate threat posed by groups mobilized by these confessional differences. And he uses specific locations to illustrate these deep-seated patterns of conflict, starting with the sectarian wars of Northern Ireland.
In Belfast, the conflict was religious prods and teagues, even if political and nationalistic layers were added on top.
The hatred was institutionalized and passed down. It was literally drilled into new generations through clerical-dominated, segregated schools. He shares that famous joke about the man stopped at a checkpoint who says he's an atheist, and the guard asks, Protestant or Catholic atheist?
And Hitchens says this actually happened to a friend.
It actually happened, which shows how the religious obsession had rotted even the legendary local sense of humor. The resulting violence was horrifying, including the use of power drills to destroy the kneecaps of those who fell foul of religious gangs. The conflict maintained its fuel source precisely through the separation and indoctrination provided by the churches.
Contrast that deep-seated generational hatred with the modern, acute fundamentalism Hitchens saw in post-Saddam Baghdad, where religious extremism was deliberately used to ignite chaos.
This was the calculated terror campaign launched by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And these attacks were not random. Zarqawi actively directed terror at fellow Muslims, calling Shiites heretics and blowing up their mosques. The campaign then broadened to include bombing Christian churches, targeting unveiled women, and publicly executing Nepalese guest workers, whom they just assumed to be Hindu.
And Zarqawi was explicit about his goal.
Completely explicit. His goal was to ignite a full-scale religious war within Iraqi society to set the Crusader West's secular plans at naught. It was a strategy of radical polarization justified entirely by religious supremacy.
And then in Bethlehem, the irony is just so thick. The supposed birthplace of the Prince of Peace became a textbook example of theocratic oppression under Hamas.
The retreat from secular governance was rapid and severe. Hamas leaders quickly sought to enforce religious law, announcing that non-Muslims would be expected to conform, including the proposed al-Jizya tax on non-Muslims, the dhimmis, which is a restrictive levy from the old Ottoman Empire.
And women were targeted specifically.
Immediately. Female employees were forbidden to shake hands with men, and in the most chilling anecdote, a young woman, Yusra al-Azami, was publicly shot dead by the Vice and Virtue Squad for the crime of sitting unchaperoned with her fiancé, justified by a suspicion of immoral behavior.
That just demonstrates the absolute moral authority granted to those enforcing divine law.
Even at the cost of human life. But perhaps no example in the book carries the weight of institutional failure and complicity as profoundly as the Rwanda deathicide. This wasn't just individual piety leading to violence, this was the church hierarchy actively participating in mass murder.
The details are just agonizing.
They are. Rwanda was the most Christian country in Africa, 65% Catholic. Hutu power militias, often incited by state and church figures, fell upon their Tutsi neighbors. The very structure of the church, which often held the loyalty of both Hutu and Tutsi, was leveraged for murder.
Priests and nuns pointed out locations where Tutsi had fled for sanctuary.
And many mass graves are documented on consecrated church ground, including the notorious massacres at Nyaruba. He cites the specifics of the betrayal.
Like Father Wenceslas Munyashaka.
Yes, who was charged with genocide for providing lists of civilians sheltering in his church. And the profound institutional callousness is captured by Bishop Misago, who asked a Vatican emissary to tell the Pope to find a place for Tutsi priests because the Rwandan people do not want them anymore.
Wow.
The hierarchy not only failed to stop the genocide, but in many instances actively aided it by prioritizing ethnic hatred over universal morality. Hitchens notes the fact that the Pope never made a public denunciation of the Church's broad complicity, and that just underscores the profound moral failure of the institution itself.
So if the historical evidence shows religion poisoning the public sphere, Hitchens argues the textual evidence shows Scripture poisoning morality itself. Far from being a source of moral guidance, holy books are rife with terrifying commands and justifications for heinous acts.
Absolutely. Acts like slavery and misogyny. The texts are moral anchors dragging us backward. U.S. slavery, for instance, was warmly approved and blessed by Christian states and churches, finding ample textual justification.
And in Judaism?
In Judaism, the misogyny is codified. The Talmud commands the observant male to thank his maker every day that he was not born a woman. These texts are so clearly products of prejudiced societies, not timeless ethical revelation.
And then there are the direct commandments, like Moses giving orders for parents to have their children stoned to death for indiscipline. Hitchens points out with that dry wit of his that this act violates at least one of the other commandments. You know, the one about not killing.
The cruelty is undeniable. But the worst example, the one Hitchens labels the quintessential atrocity, the one that poisons civilization at its root, is the myth of Abraham offering Isaac.
That's an astonishingly harsh claim, calling the Abraham myth the quintessential atrocity. Is he not ignoring the element of faith or obedience here, or does he argue that the moral outcome is the only thing that matters?
For Hitchens, the moral outcome is everything. He argues that Abraham was willing to murder an innocent, his own son, in expiation of his own crimes, simply because he believed himself commanded by God.
And this establishes the dangerous precedent of divine command theory.
Exactly. Morality derived entirely from the arbitrary will of an external authority, requiring the sacrifice of innate human empathy and reason. It demands what amounts to moral suicide, the willingness to commit murder for no reason other than blind obedience. The story is an ethical lesson on why one should never put a divine command above conscience.
We also see a significant moral devolution when comparing the Old Testament's concept of punishment versus the New Testament.
Yeah. This is a crucial distinction he makes. Moses' God was terrifying, but his wrath was generally temporal. His God was essentially finished with his victims when the grave closed. Sometimes he'd curse the progeny, but the suffering ended in death.
But Jesus introduces something else.
Hitchens emphasizes that it was the Prince of Peace, Jesus, who introduced the ghastly idea of further punishing and torturing the dead with everlasting fire. This concept of hell, formalized in the New Testament, provided the theological justification for clerical sadists ever since, weaponizing the fear of eternal physical agony.
To counter the ubiquitous claim that morality must be divinely inspired, Hitchens uses Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the supreme counterexample of profound, successful humanism.
King's strength came from empathy, nonviolence, and profound human decency. He used the Mosaic narrative only as a powerful metaphor for liberation, but he explicitly rejected the cruel commandments. There was no stoning of children, no genocidal bloodletting in his doctrine.
So Hitchens' point is that King's moral system was so robust, so clearly rooted in human empathy, that it would have worked just as well if his followers were raised on, say, Xenophon's Anabasis.
And why Anabasis? That seems like a random choice. A Greek historical account of a military retreat.
Because Anabasis is a purely secular text, detailing the struggles of Greek mercenaries trapped deep in Persian territory after a failed campaign. It's a story of courage, discipline, solidarity, and ingenuity, all purely human virtues that allowed them to organize, survive, and find their way home through sheer secular effort.
I see. So he uses this classical parallel to prove that morality, social cohesion, and the highest human virtues are innate, secular, and not dependent on the cruel or arbitrary commandments of Scripture.
Exactly. And the conflict with science shows that religion doesn't just fail to improve morality. It actively causes massive lethal harm by obstructing medical and intellectual progress. The polio vaccine fiasco, interrupted by religious dogma, is a devastating modern case study.
It's a tragedy that perfectly illustrates how bad epistemology kills people. The global campaign to eradicate polio was one of humanity's greatest successes. I mean, they managed to achieve ceasefires even in warring nations like El Salvador just to allow inoculation teams to work.
But then,
But then in West Bengal, Muslim diehards spread malicious rumors that the vaccine was a Western plot to cause impotence and diarrhea. And it got even worse in Nigeria.
where the religious resistance was formalized by a fatwa.
Yes, religious figures in northern Nigeria issued a fatwa declaring the polio vaccine a US-UN conspiracy designed specifically to sterilize true believers. This led to a catastrophic collapse in vaccination rates. The immediate result was that polio returned to Nigeria and then spread internationally, infecting Yemen, other African nations, reversing years of painstaking life-saving work.
All based on religious fear-mongering.
And conspiracy theory.
Oh.
And the Vatican's position on AIDS prevention caused a similar, globally scaled disaster, driven entirely by sexual dogma.
Right. Hitchens points to Cardinal Alfonso Lopez de Trujillo,
who publicly warned audiences that all condoms are secretly made with microscopic holes through which the AIDS virus can pass. A statement that is medically and scientifically false and just demonstrably lethal misinformation.
and other clerics, like Cardinal Emmanuel Wambala of Uganda, told their flocks that condoms transmit AIDS.
Which led to unnecessary deaths. And sickeningly, Wamala suggested that women who die of AIDS rather than use latex protection should be considered martyrs. It elevates dogmatic sexual abstinence above saving human life. It's madness.
Shifting from medicine to cosmology, Hitchens uses modern evolutionary science to systematically dismantle the argument from design, particularly Paley's watchmaker analogy.
Paley argued that the sheer complexity and presumed perfection of nature, like a ticking watch, implies an intelligent designer. But Hitchens contrasts Darwin's own initial struggle with the supposed perfection of the eye with modern genetic evidence. He shows how science has completely refuted the need for a singular designer by showing how evolution solves the same problem over and over again.
And the research by Dr. Daniel Nilsson is key here, isn't it?
Absolutely. Dr. Nilsson's work demonstrates that at least 40 to 60 different sets of eyes have evolved independently across different species on Earth. The genetic blueprint for light sensing is so fundamental that multiple evolutionary pathways converge on similar, highly functional organs. This redundancy alone argues against a single fixed plan.
And the deep-sea fish, Bathylecnops exilis, offers that perfect, specific counterexample.
It's an amazing example. The Bathylecnops exilis fish independently developed a second set of downward-gazing eyes and crucially reinvented the lens. Dr. Nilsson stated this supports the view that lenses are not difficult to evolve. Evolution, through simple natural selection, is fully capable of producing complex, sophisticated organs multiple times, demonstrating that a creative deity was not required.
So, if we are supposed to believe that God is in the details, Hitchens asks, why does the human body betray the clumsiness of an amateur designer?
The human body is just a catalog of evolutionary compromises. It carries the stamp of our lowly origin, arguing fiercely against the idea of intelligent perfection. The evidence includes our recurrent laryngeal nerve, a bizarrely inefficient detour around the aorta, the useless junk DNA littering our genome, the appendix, easily worn-out knees adapted for 4 legs, and vestigial tails.
This clumsiness suggests a slow, laborious, error-ridden process of adaptation.
Not the elegant, instantaneous creation of an omniscient being. Exactly.
Now, Hitchens is careful not to dismiss the human tendency toward wonder and mystery. He simply argues that this propensity is exploited by religion, leading us toward cognitive shortcuts and irrational conclusions.
He notes that awe is innate, but religion channels it destructively. Secular humanism can direct that awe toward man-made greatness, music, art, literature, which handles profound ethical dilemmas far better than holy books. The problem arises when this natural awe is paired with what he terms the selfishness of solipsism.
Solipsism being that deep human propensity to believe that the entire firmament is ordered for their personal benefit and that their personal fortunes are of absorbing interest to a supreme being.
It's profound vanity. I mean, how much vanity must be concealed to pretend that one's personal transient existence is the focus of a divine plan? This mental framework leads directly to manufactured certainty, the immense psychological effort required to affirm the incredible.
This sounds exhausting.
It is. To maintain faith, you must continually sacrifice self-respect, squirm in awareness of your sin, and constantly manipulate new scientific insights to fit ancient revelations. It's an exhausting process of self-deception.
And this internal psychological desperation creates a massive vulnerability to exploitation, which Hitchens refers to as the Democrat's pornography, the human willingness to be fooled.
And he details the story of Marjo Gortner, the evangelical huckster who exposed the entire racket. Gortner was thrust into the pulpit as an infant phenomenon, and later, having lost his faith, he invited a film crew to document his return to preaching, where he just explained every trick.
What did he show them?
He detailed how he timed the music perfectly to incite ecstatic effects, how he used specific rhetorical rhythms to induce people to weep and yell, and precisely how he manipulated emotional vulnerability to make women part with their savings.
It's a chilling first-person demonstration that credulity is not a virtue. It is an invitation for the wicked to exploit the vulnerable.
And this leads to Hitchens' powerful analogy of the Melanesian cargo cult. After World War II, island inhabitants saw U.S. forces build jetties and airfields and unload immense wealth cargo. They concluded that rituals, not labor, were the source of this wealth.
So they built their own.
They built simulated antennae out of bamboo and waited for the ships to arrive, believing these rituals would usher in the period of the companies and bring them cargo.
And the connection to established monotheisms is stark.
It is the perfect analogy for the material yearnings seen in established faiths. The cargo cult mimics the promise of treasure in heaven, the amassment of worldly goods, and the belief that rituals, prayer, sacrifices, tithing will deliver material prosperity. It shows how religions are manufactured in plain view, rooted in superstition, agency detection, and material expectation, rather than transcendent truth.
The willingness to exploit the vulnerable brings us inevitably to the systematic abuses enabled by religious hierarchy, particularly clerical abuse. Hitchens directly links the high incidence of clerical abuse to the institutionalized sexual repression demanded by mandatory celibacy.
He finds that when priests go bad, they go very bad indeed. The mandatory celibacy required by the Catholic Church creates an ideological vacuum of sexual repression that contributes structurally to the problem.
And worse than the individual acts.
Worse than the individual acts, the systematic rape and torture of children were aided and abetted by a hierarchy that knowingly moved offenders from parish to parish, often to locations where the pickings of the innocent and defenseless were often richer. This is institutionalized wickedness protected by religious authority.
And this compulsion to control sexual function is apparent in the religious fixation on bodily mutilation, specifically using the horrific logic Maimonides applied to circumcision.
Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish philosopher, provided a terrifyingly candid justification for circumcision. He admitted that the pain and weakening of the organ was the real purpose of circumcision, to destroy the pleasurable side of sexual intercourse and perfect what is defective morally.
He admitted that.
He admitted it. Maimonides recognized the natural revulsion a parent would feel from mutilating an infant, but repressed that innate empathy in favor of divine law. It shows religion's historical mission to target and obliterate natural human sexual function.
That repression applies to the worst female abuses as well.
Absolutely. The worst female abuses, FGM and infibulation in animist and Muslim societies, are explicitly aimed at killing the girl's sexual instinct and destroying the temptation to experiment. The religious impulse here is to control and destroy the very function of human sexuality for the sake of enforcing purity and obedience.
Shifting to political power, theocratic totalitarianism, especially in modern Iran, demonstrates religion used to justify political ambition in grotesque ways.
The religious fantasy is used to justify terrifying state ambition. Hitchens details the ritual of President Ahmadinejad thrusting a scroll down the well of the 12th Imam to update the occulted one on thermonuclear fission progress, a bizarre merging of occult fantasy and national security.
And Ahmadinejad also claimed to have been suffused with a clear green light during his UN speech.
Right, using religious delusion to justify theocratic ambition and national policy to his followers. And historically, major faiths have a consistent record of capitulating to totalitarian systems when it serves their temporal power interests.
The Catholic Church and the Nazis.
The Catholic Church demonstrated immense sympathy for fascism and signed the disastrous Reichskonkordat with Nazi Germany shortly after a new pro-Nazi pope ascended. Hitchens points out that despite the claims of moral resistance, 25% of the SS were practicing Catholics, and no Catholic was ever threatened with excommunication for war crimes.
Which proves that holy institutions are primarily man-made political structures.
That align with power and self-preservation rather than universal morality.
Okay, so he tears it all down. But what does he build in its place? His work is not merely a demolition job. It provides an affirmative, robust case for secular humanism.
Right, proposing that morality is innate and does not require divine revelation. Morality, for the humanist, comes from the internal guide or daemon that Socrates spoke of, which we now call conscience, whatever it is that makes us behave well when nobody's looking.
The secular case is built on the Enlightenment view that the moral arc of humanity bends toward empathy, rational self-interest, and collective decency.
Not obedience to cruel, ancient commands. And he points out that the ethical track record of secularists often outperforms that of the devout, particularly among America's founding intellectual class.
Historically, yes. Free thinkers like Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, and Colonel Robert Ingersoll.
Who was the nation's leading advocate of unbelief until 1899, they were consistently noted for being highly moral, generous, and civic-minded people. Their ethics were grounded in human decency, rational compassion, and a commitment to the public good, proving morality is independent of divine belief.
So for the atheist, the search for truth and beauty replaces pilgrimage and dogma, creating a superior form of worship.
The finer tradition is found in libraries and galleries. Literature, art, and music, the works of Homer, Shakespeare, Tolstoy, and Mozart. They handle serious ethical dilemmas, provide profound meaning, and inspire far better than any holy book. The loss of faith is not a void. It is compensated by newer and finer wonders revealed by science and by immersion in profound man-made culture.
And philosophically, the alternative is powerfully offered by Baruch Spinoza, who defined a concept of God that rejected the interfering scriptural deity.
Spinoza's pantheism defined a pervasive, pre-existing cosmic duty nature itself, a God manifest throughout the natural world, operating purely by rational and observable laws. This definition leaves absolutely no room for a God who intervenes, writes texts, or takes sides in petty human conflicts.
And Einstein later affirmed belief only in Spinoza's God.
Specifically rejecting a God who concerns himself with the fates and actions of human beings. This intellectual alternative provides profound reverence without dogma.
Hitchens' unique power lies in his forensic, rigorous application of critical thinking. He weaponizes his childhood training in textual analysis, the search the scriptures exercise, to his advantage against his theological opponents.
He uses that textual rigor, forcing believers back to the context and original languages, greatly to the annoyance of some of my enemies. His method is to expose contradictions and dismantle logical fallacies, like the appeal to authority or special pleading, by anchoring the debate in historical evidence, science, and the specific text itself.
He never debates revelation. He debates the evidence for the claim of revelation.
That's a perfect way to put it. And he also grounds his critique of U.S. theocracy firmly in constitutional law, citing James Madison, the author of the First Amendment, as his greatest ally.
Madison provides the ultimate defense of secular governance.
As the primary drafter of the Bill of Rights, Madison explicitly opposed the government appointment of chaplains in Congress and the armed forces, arguing it was a palpable violation of equal rights and constitutional principles because it relied on public funds to support a religious establishment.
And Hitchens notes that citing Madison today, the most important constitutional thinker, might be considered subversive or insane.
Which just underscores how far America has drifted from its original secular mandate.
We see Hitchens constantly applying Occam's razor, the principle of not multiplying unnecessary contingencies, to both ancient miracles and modern superstitions.
The UFOs and weeping statues example is perfect. If aliens want contact, Hitchens asks, why no uncut film or a piece of metal unavailable on Earth? If statues weep, why does a deity choose such a paltry effect that is easily replicable using pig fat?
The simplest explanation is the most likely.
That it is fraud, error, or wishful thinking. Any explanation involving divine or extraterrestrial intervention requires multiplying impossible, unevidenced assumptions. He always defaults to the parsimonious explanation.
And to conclude this methodology section, Hitchens presents Socrates' trial in 399 BC as the intellectual archetype for the collision between reason and dogma.
Socrates, indicted for godlessness, advocated unrestricted inquiry and refused to assent to dogma. He refused to save himself by affirming something he did not believe. He demonstrated that men of real conscience must often assert it against faith, establishing that the argument for reason begins and ends with the willingness to question everything, even unto death.
And that intellectual rigor is the method Hitchens employs throughout the entire book.
That's his whole method.
So after this comprehensive critique across history, text, and science, what is the summarized argument? Why does Hitchens conclude that religion has effectively run out of justifications?
The argument is that religion no longer offers an explanation of anything important. Thanks to the telescope and the microscope, thanks to science and inquiry, its command over the worldview has just vanished. Where it once prevented intellectual rivals, it can now only impede and retard progress. It is facing a choice between irrelevance and obstruction.
And the loss of faith is not a cause for despair. Hitchens argues it is compensated for by human achievement and inquiry.
Exactly. The alleged void is filled by newer and finer wonders of science, the cortex, the expanding universe, the complexity of proteins, and by immersion in man-made literature and art. The true value of a man, Hitchens asserts, is his sincere exertion to get to the truth, not the passive, prideful possession of it.
So the pursuit itself is what matters.
That pursuit, the application of reason and skepticism, is what extends human powers and perfectibility. And that pursuit, though quiet, is relentlessly persistent.
He concludes with the recognition that dissent and reason have always existed, despite ruthless suppression by theocratic powers.
He quotes the German maxim, Die Stimme der Vernunft ist leise. The voice of reason is soft. But he stresses that it is very persistent. The pursuit of truth, though often quiet and challenged, will ultimately endure.
That brings us to our final provocation, something to take away and mull over. The profound choice offered by the philosopher Lessing, which perfectly encapsulates the conflict between the comfort of revealed certainty and the active, often painful exertion of rational inquiry presented in God, is not great.
Lessing posed this question. If God offered all truth concealed in his right hand and in his left only the steady and diligent drive for truth, albeit with the proviso that you would always and forever err in the process, which hand would you humbly take?
It's the ultimate choice between passive certainty, even if false, and the active, persistent, rigorous, and often frustrating exertion of reason and skepticism. It's the difference between believing you know everything and dedicating yourself to the lifelong, glorious journey of discovering what you don't. That choice is the essence of this long-form critical thinking analysis based on Christopher Hitchens' God is not great.